Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Lottie Moore, a writer and researcher and author most recently of a very important report for the Family and Education Trust. Lottie, thank you very much indeed for joining Connor and me on a Deprogrammed this week. You recently, as I said in my introduction, published a report about the way in which across much of the education system, boys and young men are being systematically demonized. In fact, to borrow some left-wing jargon, they're in fact being essentialized and problematized in all sorts of ways that should be very concerning to parents. What motivated you to look into this, for one, and what were the key findings?
Yeah, so I started thinking about this because of a conversation that I had with a friend who has a teenage son. And she told me that at school, he was learning about toxic masculinity. And I'd also noticed among my friends this rhetoric of, we all hate men are toxic, men are bad. And I kind of started thinking that, you wouldn't say that about anyone else. You wouldn't say that about any other identity group. And so I started looking into it, and I'd written a report on gender ideology in schools. And as part of that report, we asked schools for what they were teaching for resources and materials. And although that focused on gender, I started seeing as well snippets of this kind of pathologizing masculinity in these lesson plans. What is an ideal man, toxic masculinity, how to be a feminist, how to be an ally. And so the Family Education Trust were also very interested in this. And so we joined forces to write this report where we wanted to take a look at what was happening on the ground in terms of what was being taught about this subject. And if it was just an anecdotal thing, or whether it was actually, whether it was widespread. And so I sent out in July over 300 Freedom of Information requests to a random selection of schools in England, and basically asked them 3 questions about what they were teaching boys at school about masculinity. And we found that 3 in 10 were teaching the concept of toxic masculinity in school, and that some were going even further, teaching that boys and young men are a problem for society today. And so we published the findings on Saturday, as well as lesson plans, and that schools shared with us slides from various presentations that were being taught in RSHE. And overall, the report looks at boys at school and particularly this kind of trend of teaching within RSHE.
Very quick technical question before Connor comes in. One thing that's notoriously very difficult to do is to gauge what's going on in classrooms at all. There was actually a controversy at GB News when Andrew Neil, with some sour grapes, left GB News. One of the things he divulged is that one of the suggestions being made in the GB News production room was that they should put cameras in schools and film lessons. And someone pointed out this is obviously illegal and you can't do this. So it's notoriously difficult to know how we're going to get the materials. And of course, a lot of people plead third party confidentiality as well.
Yeah.
Do you think that this method that you use to clearly get hold of lots of information can be scaled up into other areas?
I do, yeah. I'm thinking about it.
Okay. Watch this space.
I think that it's a really good method of working out what's happening. And it's not,
How did you get around the third-party providers thing?
Well, a lot of the schools are doing this in-house anyway. So not all of them are using third-party providers. And I think that we asked for names of providers that were being used, and I got a list of sort of 15 ridiculous sort of charities and organizations that are, basically just random people who go, talk that they, say they're going to talk about positive male role models and then go into schools and I don't know what they're charging. But so we got names. And I think schools are now more aware because of the kind of hoo-ha last year. And when the then Gillian Keegan, then Education Secretary, wrote to schools and said, you have to share these resources with parents if they ask. I mean, I'm not a parent. Freedom of information is slightly different. But it is, schools are still willing to give over information.
That's very encouraging.
Some of the slides that were printed in the physical handout report, which I received at the Trust conference, which you were entertainingly speaking at, were particularly alarming. The one I brought up on GB later that evening when I was asked to talk about this was there was a pyramid, or at the base of the pyramid it said, men and boys who are practicing traditional gender roles in the home, disregarding whether or not the women in their lives might enjoy that or find that attractive, leads ineluctably to the top of the pyramid where just the word rape is printed. So being protector and provider automatically makes you the worst kind of perpetrator of abuse. What sort of other insidious material did you see?
Yeah, so the pyramid of sexual assault or pyramid of male violence, I don't know, it's called various things. That is one example in the report, but that came up in about 4 or 5 schools. So that's doing the rounds. And the other kind of resources that we got were around male mental health. And obviously, there is a problem. There is a mental health crisis. Young men, and the way that schools are talking about it, that emotional repression or the fact that boys generally express their emotions differently to women was somehow implicitly toxic behavior. So there was one slide where they were talking about, I don't know, so-and-so doesn't want to talk about his feelings. And then on the other hand, so-and-so does want to talk about his feelings. Which behavior is positive masculinity and which behavior is toxic masculinity, which is just insane. And that was something that I found really concerning. And there is a lot of work being done on how the kind of therapeutic model is very much based on females, because women like talking, women like to talk about their feelings, and men don't. And the idea then that the default is the female model, and therefore anyone who doesn't fit into that is inherently, emotionally repressed, probably going to become a murderer, serial killer, and it's just ridiculous. But that was very common, and that was the concerning thing for me. It wasn't just that stuff about traditional gender roles then, inadvertently leading to killing your wife or whatever. It was actually this sort of very subtle, sort of trying to encourage boys to open up, and then the assumption that if they don't, that there's something wrong with them.
Absolutely. Men are, we were talking it's funny, before you came on, we were talking a lot about how men and women just do have these wonderful differences, which is a testament to the ambiguous complementarity that exists between the sexes. We are different, but we do gel very well when we're at our best and when we're calling each other to virtue, as we all should be. But when a man is feeling down, I'm not going to name any names, but Colin and I are in some group chats, and when a certain person is going through a bit in life, some struggle in life, we don't say, well, let's all go on a coffee date together and sit on some big beanbags and hash it out. Yeah. We actually tease each other. We are quite cruel to anyone reading it would think, gosh, these guys are psychopaths. But it's our way of being affectionate, and that needs to be understood. When men do find themselves in difficulty, and of course men do find themselves in difficulty, and there is a mental health epidemic that it largely is downstream of the feminization of our society. And so to double down on that feminization in your attempt to solve it is so misguided and does a disservice both to men themselves and to the women in those men's lives.
Yeah, I agree.
Have either of you had the unpleasant experience of reading Caitlin Moran's recent book, What About Men, by any chance?
No.
So those are hours of my life that I'll never get back. But I have noticed a sort of discourse around what I think is a female knowledge class management of what is perceived to be male misbehavior. Yeah. And she went into it having been a long career as a feminist writer, going, I've just noticed that these young men are suffering because I have nice young men in my life. And so what's the problem with men and how do we provide the solution? She gets this chapter about how men communicate. She says they basically sit there and exchange information with one another, and they never explain one another's feelings. And so this is why they have all of these problems bottled up and repressed. And this is why male mental health must be a problem. And therefore, all we need to do is treat young men like defective girls and encourage them to share their feelings more. Yeah. So actually, rumination probably doesn't help men. If you give them a practical way of solving their problem, it's going to help them a lot more. But so to link that into a question, how much of this do you think is ideology permeating the education sector, or is it that there's not enough the presence of men in the education sector, and so it's not really being balanced out. Does that make sense?
That's a good question. I think probably the former. I mean, you can't have a conversation about sex inequality in the UK without it being viewed through a feminist lens. You know, it's really difficult to talk about boys on their own terms. And actually, you know, Labour government put out something recently about how they're going to bring in specific education for boys in order to combat violence against women and girls. So that you can't talk. There's a risk associated with talking about boys on their own terms because, you know, there isn't an understanding that sex inequality can run both ways. And it does, because if you look at the education system, there is a massive attainment gap in boys and girls and how they're doing. You know, white working class boys, white boys on free school meals are the least likely to progress to higher education. But you can't say that, you can't talk about that. And particularly within schools, there was also this question that was being asked, which is, you know, how do boys become feminists? How can you be an ally to the women in your life? And you can't, all of these things are viewed through this sort of feminist lens. And, you know, there's been a really, really good push to get girls into STEM subjects. So science, technology, engineering, maths. There hasn't, I mean, they're all HEAL. I think it's Jonathan Haidt that talks about HEAL, which is sort of health, education, arts, and I don't know what the L is. Sorry, it is in the report.
Maybe literature or something.
Yeah, something like that. You know, kind of feminine things. There's no similar drive to get boys into HEAL subjects because, like, you know, they're not taking them up. They're not doing them. So why is it only one way? And then you don't have men in, you know, men generally aren't in education. And so maybe it's a bit of both, but I do think the former. And going back to your discussion about the way men interact with each other and women interact with each other, there's a lot of discourse that is, you know, it is just blatant misandry. It's not constructive. You know, there's a hashtag on Twitter which is kill all men. There was an article that was written a few years ago by, you know, a feminist, and it's talking about, it's called Men Are Trash. And in it, she goes on about all the things that are wrong with men. And then she goes, I mean, I really like my dad and my boyfriend's great. And also I've got some really good male friends, but men are trash. It's ridiculous.
It always, yeah, yes. I would, again, we were talking about this before you came. I'd have to say now that you mentioned this, at Taylor Swift concerts, she will routinely has this sort of line. Connor's actually a fan of Taylor Swift, by the way.
I went.
Thanks for throwing me on the bus.
I did go. I went.
You were there?
I was there, and she screamed,
F the patriarchy.
Yeah, to 96,000 people. And everyone cheered.
Yeah,
they
loved it.
And I mean, you're paying. I mean, I paid 150 quid for that ticket.
I'm suddenly less envious, by the way.
but I mean, you're not talking there to a load of oppressed women.
Oh, I know, and I'm sure this not true in your case, but a lot of those women, their boyfriends or their fathers will have been paying for those tickets, for one. The men who ensure the security of the stadium. Well, I just beg the question: is men ensuring the security of that stadium?
Taylor Swift's own father.
Taylor Swift's own father investing in her career. You know, the stadium was built by men predominantly, and then you've also got cases where in Austria, a Taylor Swift concert recently, an Islamic terrorist plot was foiled by the authorities, and it was obviously as you might expect, the Austrian intelligence services are predominantly male sphere as well. So what Taylor Swift is describing is the patriarchy in large part. If you take it literally, what she means by it, it just means the sort of the male dominated spheres of competence in our society. They are themselves male, and she wouldn't exist without them. So it's particularly grating in that case, I must say.
Yeah. But it's everywhere. It's very common. And then I think that the thing with RSHE, which is why I think it gets...
Remind us what that is again.
Relationships, sex and health education. The thing, you know, it's not English or maths. It's not, you know, kind of core subject. But it gets a lot of attention because it's unique by nature of the fact that it is dealing with issues that are highly personal and relate intrinsically to family life and have sort of societal significance far beyond the remit of the schools in charge of teaching it. And so all of this kind of, like you say about Taylor Swift, and this kind of the noise that's going on in society more widely on sexism and masculinity and all of these different things, that the extent to which it then is sort of comes into the classroom, it does matter. And that is why it has become a kind of contentious issue, because I think it's mainly in the last 3 or 4 years, with the kind of rise of parents realizing that, teachers are, schools are telling them that their kids can change sex and all that kind of thing. But there is a legitimate question, which is, how much is the state responsible at all? Does it have any interest at all in educating children on things which are so intrinsically private and personal to those children and their families? And that's a kind of wider question which we didn't go into. It was beyond the scope of the report. But I think that that's why it gets so much kind of, it does get more traction than it probably otherwise would.
I think there's a more direct relationship between the state and its constituents, its citizens, its subjects and the like now, because the Russian nesting doll of all of the private social institutions, including the family and the congregation, the community, have been taken away.
Yeah.
And so now you've got the smallest doll inside the biggest doll, and they're sort of rattling around a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly pronounced because lots of young boys now, I think it was Dame Rachel D'Souza's research that found about 2 years ago, 44% of boys in England and Wales have reached 18 and are in a household where their father is either scarcely or never present.
Yeah.
And so now the state is stepping in to teach them these new values of family, sexual health, relationships. Obviously, the Conservative government brought it in 2020 and made it so that you cannot withdraw from the relationships component of it. Is that correct?
So you can withdraw from sex education. You can't withdraw from relationships or health. But the thing I always say to that is that it's not just within RSHE that these ideas are being talked about. It's school assemblies and, the kind of interest clubs, the LGBT club after school or at lunchtime, whatever it is. So you can withdraw from the sex element of RSHE, but you can't withdraw from the relationships and health element. And even then, you're not really, it's wider than just a kind of hour a week or whatever it is that RSHE is taught.
Well, the assemblies themselves are particularly egregious. I know of a case in a pretty well-performing Catholic school where the local council is very Labour controlled. And so they made the governors appoint a diversity and inclusion head, especially after 2020, Summer of Floyd. And she has conducted sex-segregated and race-segregated assemblies. And so that's not even according to the kind of thing that you can set guidance on necessarily for RSHE. That's just some state-appointed bureaucrat stepping in, taking their own initiative and dividing the kids along identity lines. And that's quite a difficult thing to even find out about, let alone set guidance around, I'd imagine.
Yeah. And I think that, so the guidance is statutory, and that came out in 2019. In 2020, RSHE was made mandatory in all schools. And so we have made it we've said, or the government has said, and it is now an institution within schools, which is actually very difficult to get rid of once you say to schools that you have to do it. And so I think there is a wider question of whether schools should be doing this at all. I would say that they shouldn't. And
I imagine many parents at home would agree with you, not least because they just wouldn't trust the state or state-devolved bodies to be doing this in responsible ways and in ways which don't lead to precisely the kinds of howlers that you isolate and identify in your report, and which have been identified in policy exchange reports and others as well. Do you not think that so, I mean, I was talking earlier about those sort of very ambiguous and happy complementarity between men and women. Do you not think that the underrepresentation of male figures in educational institutions probably does go some way to explaining why so many young men feel dispossessed, overly feminized in terms of pedagogical techniques? I mean, when you read about, I this is a bit of a random thing, but when I remember reading Roger Scruton's autobiography once, or his memoir, it's called Gentle Regrets. And he talks about being at school, and he talks about how lots of the teachers were sort of authoritative, hyper-competent men who had been in war. and they brought that natural sternness to them and that competence. But it was a kind of tough love that was sort of meted out, and it formed a real character. And I think this is very important for young boys. I mean, if you just watch a group of young boys in a field on a Sunday that they're playing football, and if you have a really kind of good get stuck in manager, or usually one of the dads who's just kind of orchestrating or leading, they're all glowing. They're really responding to that. And I wonder how much of the fact that you have lots of very good and public spirited and diligent women operating in primary schools and secondary schools, but it's hard to replicate that in a way which really makes men feel listened to and addressed. Do you not think that rebalancing the gender balance in schools would go some way to helping this?
Yeah, I think it would. I think I mean, I think because when I think there's 3.2 million single parent households, the last data that came out last year. And what you're talking about in practical terms is fatherlessness, because 85% of those households are made up of mothers. And so I think as well, something like 76% of young men in prison grew up with an absent father. So it's clearly an issue. It's a massive problem.
Gaping hole.
But again, I think this whole kind of feminist, liberal feminism, which has kind of come in very strong, has kind of taken away the role of the father in some way, or it's kind of negated it. And this is the consequence. And we talk about that in the report. We also talk about extreme figures like Andrew Tate. And you think, well, if you don't have a dad growing up, and you are being told at school that just by virtue of existing, you're toxic, there's something in you that you need to exercise in order to exercise
yes.
in order to be a functioning human. And then you see someone like Andrew Tate, who is basically, is a really horrible man.
Pimp turned imam is my usual phrase for that. He's a former pornographer who then magically discovers the Quran and is absolved of his sins, yet defines his entire sense of worth by having a harem and a fleet of Bugattis. Is not probably
exactly. But
no wonder they're turning to him.
Yeah. And I think as well, we have to be clear. Not all boys are turning to Andrew Tate. But there was a study that was done by King's College a couple of years ago, and they found that they asked a group of young people what they thought about Andrew Tate. Most people were like, he's horrible, it's a horrible bloke. But there was more likely to be young men who actually thought, I actually think he's all right. I
would be interested to see, actually, the sort of ethnic breakdown of that, because, of course, Gen Z is the most ethnically diverse cohort. We do know the fatherless statistics, and therefore often the prison statistics, skew towards young ethnic minority men. And Andrew Tate himself being half black, being a Muslim, I just anecdotally as well, I've seen less young white men, maybe of our sort of disposition, gravitate towards his brashness.
Yes.
But I wouldn't be shocked if young inner city fatherless black kids who see all this affluence and this sort of self-control think, like that sort of guy. So I think there's a sort of vacuum there. Because it's funny, because when you say liberal feminism, immediately my ears perked up, and I was thinking, my friends Mary Harrington or Louise Perry have done a great service with their academic work, talking to young women and going, but is the birth control pill really in your interest? Are you dating the sort of men you want? Aren't you exhausted by work? Isn't there a different mode?
Yeah.
I don't think lots of young men, particularly young, ethnically diverse, fatherless men, have many solid role models. And so Tate sort of stepped into that vacuum.
And I think as well, this kind of like androgynous male, which is, feminism has also encouraged this sort of infantilization of men, which is, my dad at my age, 28, was married with 2 children, providing for the family. And that was great. That was good. And now if you look at, and I know there's lots of different reasons for this, but this kind of, I think a side effect of liberal feminism, which is that women can have it all, which we can't, but, women can have it all, work like a dog, and then, get a surrogate or have IVF or whatever. It encourages men to act like children for longer. And that's not me being sexist. That's just kind of, I think, a side effect of feminism is this kind of, and again, this sort of toxic masculinity, all men have to be, feminists, all the rest of it. It doesn't encourage men to be providers. It doesn't encourage men to use their natural ability to provide for the family and commit themselves to a cause that's greater than them. It's all quite self-indulgent.
Completely, and both sexes are relentlessly denatured by this culture.
Yes, that's a great term.
What you get is, and as applied to sex as well, we've spoken about this on the show before, and the way I like to put it is that what the sexual revolution does by that sort of obviously enabled by that step change in technology, namely the pill, is that it divorces intimacy on the part of men from their sense of responsibility, and it divorces intimacy on the part of women from their heart. And those are the two sort of main focal points that I think both sexes bring. Obviously, men's hearts are engaged as well, and women's responsibilities are engaged too. But predominantly, it's a man's sense of responsibility that is engaged when he's having an intimate act with a woman he loves, and likewise, it's a woman's heart that's being engaged. And once that's just gone, because there's no consequences naturally follow necessarily from sex anymore. That denaturing process is made even more stark.
Yeah.
And it's very regrettable. What are men doing? So you talked about the Andrew Tate phenomenon, young boys, and like, how is this? I mean, I suspect this is having a very strong. I think I would suspect that this explains much of the gendered political divide that we're seeing. Are men? What are the consequences of this politically and maybe socially and culturally for young men in terms of their outlook? Some flocking to Tate. What other sorts of activities are young boys and men engaging in off the back of feeling demonized? And
I think porn is a huge problem.
Yeah.
That children's Rachel D'Souza's report said something like boys as young as 9 now.
The average age of viewing is about 11, and she said the overwhelming majority of reports. So the most common sexual crimes are now between children, and the overwhelming majority of those case reports feature pornography as a sort of inciting influence as reported by the perpetrator. So and other than Miriam Cates and a few Republican Congress people, like the very local level in the state, nobody's really interested in passing ID verification laws as you would if you had to buy the physical thing.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, again, liberal feminism, this idea of sex work as a form of work. So if you take that idea as in to its end, why are we not having the local brothel in the school careers fair? Well, no, but
you're not wrong. Yeah,
no, you're right. Yes.
If sex work is work, why are they not the graduate fairs? Because you make good money, because it's a form of exploitation.
Yeah.
And I think that the kind of, again, this idea of feminist porn, which is just so perverse, and the idea of sex work as work, it's all part of the same thing. And I think we need to take a step back. Firstly, stop pathologizing men and women. Get masculinity out. Get masculinity, and also we don't talk about in these lesson plans. There's no talking about what's the ideal woman. There's no one talks about that.
It's just completely self-generative because liberal feminism defines it as you fulfilling your own very independently formed ambitions.
And I did see a resource that was talking. It was in a general slide, a general presentation for year 10s, which is I think 14, 15-year-olds, on relationships and masculinity. And there was a paragraph that said, Susie is. And it was talking about stereotypes, gender stereotypes. It was like, Susie is a 13-year-old mother who, going on this thing, right? 13-year-old mother, okay. That's rape, firstly, because she can't consent to sex, because that's rape. And basically the whole point of the slide was that, you shouldn't assume stereotypes about people. Every pathway that you choose is different. So Susie's a 13-year-old, shouldn't be demonized for being a 13-year-old mother. That was genuinely being presented to a classroom on, don't make assumptions about other people's lives. Everyone be kind. Mm-hmm. And I think that, it's a lot like the gender stuff when one of the resources that we saw on, everybody's body is different, had a load of vaginas and all the vaginas are different. One of them was an infibulated vagina, which is the
What are
worst.
they?
So that is where it's a stitched up vagina. It's a form of FGM.
Oh my God.
It's a form of FGM. And
Which women do themselves, or which is done to them?
which is done to them, yeah.
And that was put on as an acceptable vagina.
This was in, basically, everyone looks different.
Oh my
So
God.
there are all these different types of vagina. One of them is stitched up. If your vagina looks like that, you are a victim of one of the most horrific sexual crimes, and you need to tell the police right now.
Which is going up in the UK as well.
yeah,
There's a Guardian
yeah.
report earlier this year that said in the last 3 or so years there's been a 60% increase. I wonder what caused that, of course. But then you're not encouraging young girls that might be looking at that to then go and report that horrible crime.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
But again, this kind of normalization of I guess we've got it's this kind of I was like the kind of the allyship thing. It's again, we don't just have to respect other people anymore and not break the law and be not and try and be, we have to be an ally and accept everyone for everything, and actually, that's not always appropriate. That's not that's not right.
It's downstream of a very, very idealistic view of the human person, whereby there's no such thing really as there's nothing that's essentially wrong with human nature. Human nature can express itself in multiple, manifold ways. The only problem is the way in which we process that, the way in which we create concepts, the way in which we build institutions. And so what we need to do, everything becomes a question of just social engineering. And if only we could socially engineer acceptance, then there wouldn't be these sorts of hierarchies between different types of bodies anymore. But it's particularly horrific when we're talking about cases of stitched up vaginas or girls who are 13 years old, where the destigmatization comes before doing the right thing by the law and by basic ethics, medical ethics.
The perfect example of this was your prior paper with Policy Exchange, which was excellent, Asleep at the Wheel, which alongside the Cass report eventually got some guidance changed. I don't think the current Labour government are all that receptive to that. No. But some of the most alarming stats that were in there was it 69% of schools are trans affirming, and about a quarter of students leave school at 18 with an LGBT identity. How many of those are just sort of girls identifying in the more nebulous categories for social clout is obviously up in the air. But I wanted to pick up on that because going back to the earlier point, all of these things are being done not necessarily in the explicit sexual and health education guidance classes. They're part of safeguarding training. They're part of general assemblies. They're just part of how students are encouraged to talk to each other. So it seems that these schools are just an ideological petri dish where this thing is just permeating. What do you do to combat that other than file off FOI requests?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and there has been a really successful pushback. If you look at the gender critical kind of move, there's a reason they call the UK turf island.
It's one of the only victories we've scored.
Yeah, but there is and it's a very much a grassroots thing. I don't know how far it has to go, before something changes. But I know that there has been a couple of parents who have organised mass sort of my child's got the dentist when there's RSHE, and then there's just no class as a tactic. And I think that's happened a few times in America.
Yes,
I don't know.
There are some recommendations at the end of the report on that.
Yeah, so that parents should be able to remove their child from all elements of RSHE.
Not just the sex.
Not just the sex.
And by sex, we mean sexual education.
Sex education, yeah. That any kind of teaching on toxic masculinity must be removed from the curriculum. There needs to be more emphasis on male role models at school. And also, in terms of Ofsted should be looking at the gender, that it should be an active measure, the gender attainment, the gender gap between outcomes must be a kind of mandatory Ofsted measure, so that schools need to be monitored on what they're doing to kind of combat it, rather than just letting boys get on with it, letting teachers get on with it, and kind of boys being treated as defective girls essentially.
How much of this is so kind of going back now a tiny bit? How much of this is a problem with central government? You've clearly implied quite a lot of it, given the statutory nature of the guidance that you were talking about. but how much of this is a problem with local government, local councils, and maybe indeed sort of complacency, not to criticize them too much, but complacency on the part of the parents? Because most people are conservative-minded. Most people, in England at least, historically have just been fairly trusting of institutions. Very few people feel a desire to be sort of proactively one of the governors at a school. It's usually only a minority of people who do that. How much of it is complacency at the local level, or indeed activism on part of local councils, and how much of it is just all being dictated in this kind of dirige style from central government? In your from your telling,
I think it's a mixture of both. I think for example, the parents who all have a dentist appointment, take their kids out for a dentist appointment, you have to be able to do that, right? And you have to care enough to do that. I also think that I don't want to demonize schools. I think schools are like, a lot of these lessons, they are well-meaning. They are well-meaning. They're well-intentioned. And I also think that it's a reflection of which we've seen in the private sector as well, where if you can adopt a cause, it's really good for your career. So I actually spoke to a head teacher after Asleep at the Wheel came out, who rang my office, and he said that, a really, really mediocre teacher started an LGBT group and, became this sort of LGBT activist, climbs up the safeguarding ladder, is suddenly like, deputy head. And he said, it's astounding because no one can say anything because, he's doing God's work. And yes. I think that there is a kind of bit of that going on. But I do think as well, like RSHE is not, the government is concerned with, league tables and maths results and English results and all of those things. RSHE is the kind of thing, when I was at school, it was the DOS subject. You just kind of sat back and like laughed at, it's not considered a kind of important sort of subject. So it becomes a kind of, you can kind of make it up as you go along. And I think if you are a kind of young teacher that's, quite idealistic and liberal and whatever, you would probably think, oh, okay, we'll do a presentation on feminism because that's the right thing to do.
Definitely agree with you. I think that this is sort of a weird kind of alliance, and Kaufman makes this argument to I think, very effective, very good effect in his book Taboo. Eric Kaufman. Talking about how this is basically an alliance between, you have this kind of hardcore set of activists who are driving things, but these sorts of bleeding heart, well-intentioned types, precisely the kind of people who are likely just to be a primary school teacher. Obviously, you get the nuts as well who go into primary education precisely in order to indoctrinate into a particular view of the world. It's basically just these well-intentioned, bleeding heart people who are very receptive to this ideology because it couches itself in terms of kindness, in terms of compassion, in terms of acceptance, destigmatization. There are all these buzzwords. And I think that a lot of people clearly go in for that. So do you think that this is primarily going to be solved? Well, another thing that's important, we have a lot of viewers at home who will be parents, and they always, the most common query we get is, what can we do? What can we do? We feel powerless. Yeah. What can parents do in order to try and combat some of this as individuals, as families, in your view? What advice would you give to parents?
I mean, I think that parents should do what I know lots of parents do, which is when their children come home and say, oh, I learned that I can change sex today, and, my brothers are going to become a rapist. They go, don't be so silly. I think parents should be empowered to be parents. And Civitas just wrote a really good, Joanna Williams wrote a really good report on the sort of balance between parents and schools, and this idea that Labour's bringing in mandatory teeth brushing and all the rest of it. We've got to, as a society, as the government has got to devote itself to helping parents to be good parents, and we've got to go back to prioritizing the family. And I don't think that the feminist cause does anything for that at all. And I think that I would hope that if we start looking at the values, family values, and bringing in policies which are encouraging parents to be good parents and not relying on the state to do this stuff. Because I know that, like, most of the parents that I talk to have kids that are in state schools there where all this stuff is happening. And they just go, look, don't listen to that. It's complete nonsense. And it's kind of fine. That shouldn't have to be the case, but that is the reality.
Yes. And it's funny as well, because a lot of this activism is sort of downstream of kind of trendy 60s, new left stuff. And one of the very key figures in that movement was Theodor Adorno, who wrote a famous book called The Authoritarian Personality, in which he basically equates, quite similar to that pyramid you were talking about, he equates the very existence of a authoritative father figure in the home as being incipiently fascist. And so his basic idea is that the more you have strong family formation, the more likely that will, sooner or later, in that wonderful pyramidic fashion, lead to kind of a Hitlerian type, a Mussolini type. And that was precisely why people like him thought that the family needed to be abolished in order to ward off the ghost of mid-20th century totalitarianism. The funny thing is that it's actually when you have really strong, solid families that the state has less to do. Because it can't permeate those sorts of structures.
Yeah.
So you want sturdy family structures, ordered liberty in that way, in order to ward off authoritarianism, not the other way around. Otherwise, you're just, as Connor sort of implied earlier with his Russian nesting doll thing, you're left with the individual quaking before Leviathan, and Leviathan's going to win.
The other thing that was in your report, in the complete inverse of that, particularly in Asleep at the Wheel, is the amount of young girls. I think it was a 1,400% rise in young girls being diagnosed as trans at Tavistock. But lots of these young girls had, in Tavistock's own internal case notes, 5 to 6 compounding mental comorbidities.
And Cass found that as well.
Yeah, and there were lots of ones, one of the stats that you pulled up as well, lots of them disproportionately were in care. And so if they don't have that, not just father presence, but any familial presence whatsoever, they're the most likely to be preyed upon by these ideologies. And they're also the least capable of coming home at the end of the day. And the parent just goes, they question them a little bit and they goes, that's silly. Don't worry about it. They're lying to you, dear. They've got no one in their lives to do that. So they fall through the cracks. And so it's unfortunate that at the moment we have a government who are not only not receptive to that, but are actively looking to accelerate it, because those exact kinds of young, vulnerable girls and demonized boys will be falling through the cracks of this stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, when I was at school, the trend among girls was eating disorders. It was really cool to have an eating disorder. And the teachers would say, don't be so stupid, eat your lunch, right? This is you now have girls going, I want to chop off my breasts. And the teachers are going, great, that's great. It's completely insane that you have, this is a mental health issue, which is being treated as an identity thing that then is being affirmed, when we wouldn't do that with any other kind of, mental health issue. If a girl came into school and said, I'm going to kill myself this evening, teacher would not say, okay, yeah, go and do that. How can I help?
You wouldn't treat anorexia with liposuction.
No, exactly. And that is the equivalent. And I think that the kind of social contagion among teenage girls, puberty is a difficult time for both sexes, but it is, when you there's lots of 12-year-old girls that easily pass for 16, and you think, hang on a minute, I've suddenly got this body which I don't know what to do with, which is sexualized, and I hate it. Okay, how can I do something? Okay, well, I'll starve myself, I'll cut myself, or I'll be trans. Yeah. And the former, you go, no, that's not right, and it's fine, you'll get there, it's okay. And the last one, we go, how can I help you to basically, de-sex yourself?
Yes.
Which I think is just horrific.
It really is extraordinary. Well, Lottie, the last thing I'll ask you before we have to conclude, what else are you going to be working on? What have you got in the
that's a good question.
In the pipeline?
I think that something I'm interested in is this kind of the mental health stuff, in terms of the idea that you would put mental health nurses in every school. I think is a terrible idea.
Why?
Because I think if you it wasn't that long ago that I was a teenage girl. If you asked me how I'm feeling, I would tell you all manner of things. I think we kind of this sort of pathologization of emotion into some kind of like everyday ordinary emotions into mental health problems when normal feelings. I think, and Mary Wakefield wrote a really good essay in the Spectator last week, I think, on ADHD in adults. And I see that a lot. There's like a lot of young women now are getting ADHD when I think you're just a bit hungover on a Friday and you're finding it difficult to concentrate. Like, we've all been there.
Yeah.
Well, you're constantly on TikTok, so no wonder your attention
Yeah,
span is
exactly. So something on that, I think. That wasn't particularly coherent, but...
No, it was perfectly coherent. And when you've got it all written down, it's been published, we must have you back.
Oh, thank you.
Lottie Moore, thank you very much for joining us on Deprogram. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.